so much, Karthik, making this event possible. In fact, it's my privilege and pleasure to be part of this event. Something I'd also been aware of this platform study circle of Ambedkar and Martin Luther King, and it's been really, really important intervention in public forum. I would call as outside of the formal academic forum. I think this intervention has tremendous impact on the opinion and the other key factors that otherwise does not get noticed. So I'm really happy to be part of this platform here. And before I go, I have just made my presentation sort of semi-structured academic presentation. Therefore, I will have my PPT here. Let me take that. Thank you. Yeah. So now the basic, just a brief presentation. I'll make it very, very brief and to the point. So this book actually revolves around two fundamental questions, but actually it involves in look at most of the literature pertaining to the caste and region in India. I will make a fundamental argument in this book. The caste, I mean, the individuals belonging to the caste or the region, place, decides the life cycle of opportunities of the individuals in India. It's like you take which caste you belong to, whether which region largely decides your life. If one has to call as an opportunity space, I think that is largely decided by region and caste. So then question is, why certain regions actually develop in India? Okay. Yeah. So the question is, as I mentioned earlier, the region and caste decides individual opportunities, or one has to call it opportunity space in India. So the question then is, why certain regions grow or develop in a particular way? Even if they develop in a particular way. For instance, we know the debate in India, there are certain regions which are known for economic growth. For instance, I'm sure you would have heard this question of, say, Gujarat model and Kerala model, different regions having a different historical trajectory and particular way of looking at the economic outcomes. Then you have a second question is the caste mobilization, also known across India, but in certain regions, the caste mobilization does or produces different outcomes. For instance, the southern state Tamilnadu has been pioneer in that way of the anti-caste mobilization since it's a long time, and more than 100 years now. And you also see the Maharashtra from Ambedkar and the long tradition in Maharashtra. Then you have seen the last 30 years or maybe 40 years, you can see in the north, particularly in Bihar and UP. So you have a caste mobilization across India. Maybe it comes in a different form. It takes a different form. The question is why and how this caste mobilization impact broader developmental outcome. Because normally the caste question is seen as sort of identity question or question something to do to address the discrimination or the question of dignity. But we here frame that question. It is actually a key to not just a dignity, it is also broader developmental pattern of any region if you take. So because the caste works as a significant variable to explain our lack of the development, that way, both ways it explains. So the question is why and how it affects the development. This is the broad two questions that we're trying to address in this book. So as I mentioned earlier, if you look at the big debate, which I'm sure those who are in economic, those who have been following the economic debate in India since 2014, when the Narendra Modi became a prime minister, this became the big debate. Like one side, the economists actually praise the Gujarat as a model, something that the rest of the India has to follow. Then you have a Kerala and Himachal Pradesh, which actually put forth by Amartya Sen and others. That is actually the model, something that if the rest of India has to follow, something to be emulated. So then in these two extremes, one is the growth centric, the other one is the development centric. Development, I mean here is the education and health. So this actually is, Himachal is known for its health education outcomes. The Kerala, of course, for its health outcome and broad even education too. So in this two polarized debate, we were trying to look at, there is something you can actually learn from Tamil Nadu, which actually seems to be combining this both. A part of developmental narrative, which is a relatively inclusive health and education, and also a relatively better or broad-based economic growth. If you take a pure economic indicator, say the growth rates or the industrial share or the manufacturing and the spatial distribution of industries, if you look at the key indicators, you can certainly find the state seems to be doing relatively better in both. So therefore, we thought to make a claim that this region gives a different historical trajectory or different possibilities. The question is, why and how this became possible? That's an important question in the sense How this became possible? Is there any planned narrative, or this is like a party or the institutional way that was actually decided that in Tamil Nadu is going to go this way? Or is there any spontaneous outcome which is irrespective of the political formation? So this is something is a question that we wanted to take, and therefore we took a longer history of the state, looked at this material through assembly debate, census data, and of course, socio-economic indicators based on health, education, and of course, GDP, those figures from RBI. So we mapped all these data sets to identify when this structural break, or at all, if at all there's a structural break within Tamil Nadu, made this possible of combining this growth and development. This is particular respect to the region. Then again, question is, because this regional aspect also, we strongly believe, even if you take the Kerala model, you cannot talk anything in India without talking about caste. So we actually somewhere try to bring this region question with the caste questions together to understand the Tamil Nadu trajectory. That's actually some way you can call as a innovative, because those who talk about region do not actually take into account of the caste specificity of those regions, how the caste actually intersects with the regional processes. So that's actually our intervention in this, to bring this together. Again, as you know, why this is matters, because why you actually bring important caste as an important variable in public policy in India. You know, in political science literature, those who are familiar with the political science literature are aware that this is a big debate. The debate is this: if a society is divided by ethnicity or caste, or called as a stratified society, so any kind of public policy in support of poor is become difficult, because there's a limited resource with the state. State I mean here the government, and that resource is being pulled out by generally with the dominant elite, or even the prioritize certain sector or certain factors at the expense of others. So, for example, if one region puts a lot of money, say in higher education at the expense of primary education, or put the money in tertiary care at the expense of primary care, or put the money in, say, IT or IIM, not at the expense of schools or the basic infrastructure, say in villages, roads, and others. So particularly then the question is, who actually is driving this? Whose interest that government or state is functioning? So therefore, we make it, I mean, this is actually known in the political science literature. It's only in certain condition or certain way, if you bring together oppressed caste groups together, when you have a very divided society, it could be based on ethnicity, it could be based on caste, it could be based on religion, any kind of divide. So to make a claim or to build a consensus for public policy, that too in the interest of the poor or subaltern, it became a difficult. So you can have an identity mobilization, individual caste-based mobilization. To make that mobilization, translate that mobilization into a tangible economic, social outcome, you need to institutionalize certain social policies. So that you need to build up a broader collective. So for example, I give an example. In the US, that actually the divide between, we are actually, most of them are placed in the US. So we know the US, it's the divide between the blacks and whites, and why the health sector is actually in a tremendous stress. And we know now what happened through the pandemic, who actually suffered disproportionately. It is the people of color. And we also know that the white poor working class also suffered from this, because they believed that it is in the interest of the blacks that the public policy was crafted. They were against it, but they suffered it for that. So what I'm trying to say, there are a lot of evidence why the US actually went to particular health sector, which is very highly exclusive. Those who are aware of the health system in the US are very much aware that it's how exclusive this model and how it affects. Why I'm bringing this connection to US and India is, any stratified society, to build a collective and frame a policy, you need to build a consensus. To build that consensus, you need to have a call. In the US, you may call a multiracial coalition, or in India, you call as a multi-caste coalition. So in that context, we say there is something happened, which is maybe called as innovative, or it's historically given to us some way that was developed in Tamil Nadu, which I call as a Dravidian collective. So which is, I mean, I'm using here some big academic names. We can, leave that academic names, Gramsci and Laclau, which is basically to make a claim. When you have a society which is stratified, caste is like a very hierarchical structure. If you use Dr. Ambedkar graded inequality, it's like a very, very divisive and graded. So you need to bring this caste coming together, particularly the one who actually suffer at the bottom, to bring them together and to make a claim. You need to have a frame. So that frame, or maybe you call as an identity, which you call as a Dravidian identity, which some way brought this diverse caste groups together. One might have a question: is that caste, all of them are located in similar position? No, some of them, and definitely there is an hierarchy within that. But this mobilization able to build some way of the horizontal coalition. Of course, the question comes later. Obviously, as Karthik mentioned, there are limits to this because there's some benefit at the expense of others. That question still remains. We'll talk about that in detail. But the question is, to build this coalition in a stratified, caste-divided society is difficult. This is precisely, if one has to compare in the North India, in the UP, for instance, Kanshiram tried that to build what you call, as we all know, as the bomb shape, to bring this together. We also know what happened to those history. Many of those caste mobilization became a single caste clusters. Even if you take the BR, one can say that how the caste are divided in that way. Tamilnadu too, that exists as a single caste parties and trying to make it claims, but still there has been an history which tried to build this coalition, bringing diverse caste group together in the name of Dravidian identity. So Dravidian identity we do not use here as a ethnicity or something. Maybe one can have an idea of that, but here we purely use as a political identity, which actually was able to bring this diverse caste group together to institutionalize a government which brought certain institutional intervention in health, education, and economic sector. That's our conceptual framework in this book. So we can actually discuss about the limits of this mobilization and how much is institutionalization of those social policies that we can discuss in detail. But fact remains, this identity played bringing this caste together. This identity played institutionalizing certain policies, and that policies have worked delivering certain inclusive socio-economic outcome. That's our argument in the book. So now, if you look at the specific sector by sector, we can see the education. Again, as I mentioned earlier, in India, if you look at the debates within the education sector, I begin with Myron Venice, a famous political scientist, was in MIT here. He actually did this brilliant book. Everybody should read how caste and education is intersects in India. This book is Child Labor, if I'm right, book name. And the argument of his book is, he says actually, most of the countries which got independence from British across the world, post-colonial countries, went on, including China, for instance, went on to fundamental education. They ensured 100% literacy, opened a lot of schools to ensure masses get educated. But India actually went to higher education. In the 50s and 60s, its percentage of resource allocation on primary education was very poor. So then he was actually perplexed. Why this country, which claimed to be the largest democracy, but did not put money for educating its students, its kids. So then he interviewed the planners and bureaucrats in 60s and 70s. He figured out very, very startling finding, which actually many of us may be thinking that we are aware of this, which is that he says it is definitely a caste bias among the Indian planners in 50s and 60s. They believed, why should we educate our masses? Because anyway, we are not going to give them all of them job. What is the point educating them? So then, therefore, the limited resources they put building it is IITs, IIM, and big industry. Therefore, there is a clear bias towards higher education at the expense of basic education, which is something countered in Tamil Nadu. If you look at the budgetal expenditure in 50s and 60s, disproportionately were put on primary education, open the schools, and you build that education infrastructure. Therefore, by 80s, including the midday meals and other schemes, you could ensure that there is no dropouts from schools. Then you also have opened up the higher education that we all know now, as Karthik mentioned. You see, I just given an example why education played an important role. We know now the gross enrollment ratio in Tamil Nadu is 51%. If you take, we are in the US, and if you take the corporate, here the Indian migration of those who work from India, the corporate sector, the IT sector. There's a book, if you want to know, there's 1%, which is by Devesh Kapoor. And there's some cost statistics of the engineers who come to the US. And you look at the social distribution, social profile of those engineers from Tamil Nadu and from other part of, particularly northern part of India, you would find a clear differences, the diversity within the state. Of course, within the diversity, there is unequal diversity, which we'll come back to the later. But in a relative scale, one could certainly find there is an enormous diversity played role in expanding education and making inclusion possible for many caste groups who otherwise would have not imagined to be in higher education. So this is what I make an argument here. is somewhere this elite bias was countered in schools in 60s and 70s, and the later higher education was expanded to major cost curves. And within that, one is the expanding the infrastructure. On top of that, you also brought this reservation policies, which suddenly worked of bringing this inclusion within the higher education. So this is the broad argument within education. Of course, there are flaws in it, particularly in the government school learning outcomes, something I'll come back to the later. But this is the what, if at all one has to argue what actually worked in education, this is what worked in education in the state. Similarly, in health, which is well documented, those who know, those who work on public health would know, India actually has been poor record on its expenditure on health, particularly if you look at the per capita government expenditure. And within that, the composition of expenditure is also biased towards tertiary sector, which is all again called elite bias, which actually very much there in within the health also. I just give an example. What is mean by elite bias? If you are not building a primary health care across villages and putting money like only just building an AIMS or in a particular tertiary sector in a metropolitan cities at the expense of expanding higher primary health care across districts, across say even villages, then that is actually called as elite bias. But some way, if you look at in terms of all indicators, like number of health center available, its spatial distribution, and even if you take the social profile of those health professionals, I mean here the doctors, nurses, any indicator you take, you will certainly find a relative inclusion in those profiles, and building this infrastructure at the across region, across district or rural area in Tamilnadu, which is exactly against the dominant pattern that prevailed in the rest of India, exception Kerala. So then the question is how this became possible. So again, here I make an argument. This is something, it happened in, it was actually, in fact, the Department of Public Health was formed during Justice Party time in 1922. And when India got independence in 47 and 50, when the new government came in Tamil Nadu, in fact, they strengthened it. In fact, probably, I think it's the only state in India which has separate Department of Public Health, which actually directly takes care of the primary health care system. So that actually ensured your MMR, which is using some health indicators, which is called mortality ratio, child mortality, mother mortality, maternal mortality, and other health indicators. So how all of this indicator, this is the standard measures the health economists use. So how this became possible because of this intervention. So this is, again, as I mentioned, the countering the elite bias as it happened in the health. Education also happened in the health. So now come to the question, because there are many economists claim Tamil Nadu is actually known just for, like a popular intervention for the poor, but not in entrepreneurship. They're not in the industries are still with the elites. That's one claim. We're countering that. If you look at the data, pure hard data, economic census, you would certainly find there is a degree of inclusion even in the entrepreneurship. So the idea why, because as Karthik mentioned in the beginning, there is in a sense in a caste society, there are only certain people as a born capitalist, which is tied with your occupation or your birth, that you are actually good at this. There are only certain people who are good at being educated, because others, there are only certain people who are actually known for doing a laborer work, are known for the peasantry. So this is caste-based occupation. There are certain people are born capitalists. Somewhere here has been broken that. But the question is, it's at all caste included in the entrepreneurship? There are definitely a variation within it. If you take a relative scale, you can certainly find, including Dalits and the OBCs, large extent actually gone into the maybe a small and medium scale enterprises. But even now, which is true, that the elite, the big businesses are still with the elite. But in a relative scale, you can certainly find the inclusion of entrepreneurship among these communities, particularly from the OBCs and the Dalits, in both, which is, if you can actually get this done from the economic census, and also it's tested by Dickey, the Dalit Chamber of Commerce, partly has mentioned this, because they also use the data, because I interviewed its leadership, uses data from the government, particularly from the MSME census. But even otherwise, if you look at the broad profile for one function, the organization, which region is vibrant in terms of asking and demanding certain claims. So obviously, you see the relative inclusion of entrepreneurs within the economic growth processes. So that is, again, we argue, is precisely because of these policies that the Dravidian parties have implemented. The question one might ask, is that top-down approach? Is that the only parties from the benevolent, from the top sitting did? No, it's not our argument. In fact, it is a social mobilization from the below. It made them accountable. So that actually became, it's not something in the benevolence of the elite or even the new political elite from the Dravidian parties who did. It is definitely, there was a consent, but it is also partly a response from the mobilization from the below. It is a both way work. It is from the below, from the above. Both say it worked in delivering these outcomes. So, I mean, I can go into the detail. What are the intervention happened in expanding the industrialization in the state, which is actually something which is too technical. We'll just keep this, but we can talk about this actually, which period, what infrastructure was brought in, which parties, which government was in power. We actually documented in the book. We can talk about it in this detail. So then the question is, something Karthik mentioned in the beginning, this is a rising caste violence, which is horrible. I mean, like horrendous violence is happening in Tamilnadu, particularly in the rural part of the. Why this is again our argument here, which is, in fact, it is not the deprivation, it is a relative mobility of Dalits. Particularly if you look at even in rural India, it is not no longer the elite versus the others in the rural Tamil Nadu. It is, we are acutely aware, it is actually the violence is largely done by the intermediate caste and Dalits. It's broadly between these two caste groups, two blocks, if one has to call. But if you look at the indicators, the economic indicator through education or formal sector jobs, in fact, it is no other state has seen as that level of parity or narrowing down in the rural caste inequality. That is why, in fact, the violence is the intermediate caste, certain caste groups comes forth saying that it is threatened because of this mobility. So it is, in fact, it is the caste gap actually, in fact, has narrowed down, which is, again, we say this intervention, which is one can call as intervention through education, health, and PDS, and there are other forms. If you look at the wage labor, even if you look at in the rural Tamil Nadu, which is one of the highest. So all of these indicators actually some way made this caste basis of the labor weakened. Second, caste gap has been narrowed. So, which is in the rural. Even if you take the urban land reform, which one of the concern again, which generally is critique against Tamil Nadu, is that Tamil Nadu never did a land reform, unlike Kerala or even Bengal that matter. It is certainly true. It never had a institutionalized, what you call de jure land reform, like the way it happened in Bengal. But the Bengal land reform, we know what its limits. We can go in detail later. But Tamil Nadu, of course, there's no land reform. There was, in fact, certain landed elite were associated with certain political parties. But if you look at the current data, there is a transfer, which one can call as a de facto transfer of the land ownership from the elite to intermediate caste and section of Dalits, in particular in southern part of Tamil Nadu. So definitely, I mean, it is not to say this exactly the institutionalized land reform from the Dravidian parties, but one can call as a molecular de facto land reform by people empowered through other social intervention that took place in the other domain. That's our argument. And take the urban, again, another claim is that this party is actually compromised on the workers' right, which we know that in many situations, we find that this many parties actually sided with the big capital at the expense of the workers' rights. But if you look at the pure indicators, I think the state still is able to protect its labor relatively. Again, I use the word very relative sense. If you look at the unorganized labor or even the organized labor, which is the measure that economists use, the GVA or the wages condition or the work condition, the contractual ratio, there are certain indicators which actually is relatively better. But still, again, how long this is going to continue given the rampant violation of the labor laws across India? Again, this is one has to see Tamil Nadu is working in a federal setup. It's a constitution of India and it's a one state. And for instance, if the UP actually tomorrow opens up abolishes all laws, both environment and education, so labor laws, then how long you're going to protect your capital, saying that we will not actually, we'll give an incentive more and retain your capital. Obviously, the capital will move, the factory will move. But even then, here they actually some way argue, or maybe it is the brokers or the politicians somehow able to manage or convince the existing the factories and the automobile factories and other factories that, look, we will have a productive labor, which is you call as a very educated, and you give us a decent wages. and give us a better working conditions. So not it's a zero-sum game. It is some way of one has called as some sort of negotiated settlement. But it is a fact. One has to deal with it. There is no outside. Of course, one can think of definitely a transcending a capitalist system. That is a different question altogether. But given this federal framework, given the federal structure, state is able to still support its labor through certain interventions. But there are serious limits, particularly recent time. I am aware that now there is violence happening in some part of industrial town in around Chennai. But given I'm still hopeful that been resolved with certain, protecting the workers, right? But that's been the historical case in the state. So limits, as I mentioned earlier, all of this, what I mentioned, education, health, labor, land, rural, all of this has a flaws. The flaws, here I see the one is the qualitative change, which is 100 year. 2 generation of quantitative change. But all of this indicated there's a qualitative problems. If you look at the education, you definitely improved school education, definitely improved the share of, or maybe the expansion of higher education included the groups which otherwise never been in education. But there is a different forms of hierarchy emerging, which I call as a qualitative difference, which definitely has a caste connection to it. In the sense, who could go what college, engineering college, which college takes you to Tidal Park Engineering, or which college actually gets you a job in the US. So then there is definitely a new forms of exclusion, inequality, which is directly connected with the caste equation. And I would even call caste inequalities actually moved from rural to urban in a different way. But the new set of problems. Then again, one can think of the caste violence, as I mentioned, in the rural. Now, it's a violence is again, it's a relative mobility. So if you look at the violences, even if that recent, if you map, there is a violence on the material aspect of the people. In the sense, the elite or maybe the one who actually believe above feels threatened because of the material progress. That is something these parties have failed to, or maybe the other critique is that they're actually in party with aligned with it. Whatever, but this is still, they are not able to provide institutional support to this violence. The third is definitely of the unequal share, as I mentioned, even if in the economic growth, there are certain groups actually benefited more than the others. That is going to create a block or create a problem within this Dravidian block. When I kill Dravidian block, it has to, because any identity, even any identity you bring it, you call as a OBC, any identity you bring as a common identity, there is always scope for some group would benefit at the expense of others. It is in the interest of those who claim to represent that formation, represent that block, is to address these internal divisions, internal contradictions. If you do not do it, we don't know how long this is going to sustain of this block, which so far delivered on a relative scale. But will it deliver forever without addressing this internal contradiction? Is the history is witness to that. So we'll be witness to that. So let me end here. I'll take questions. Maybe we can have more conversation on based on the questions. Yeah. Thank you, Karthik. Yeah.